everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm Robert Perry Cruz, your host, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hello, Rob. It's me, Jackie.
It's like a Muppet version of Jackie, kind of with that voice?
Sure.
It sounded as, oh, hey.
I guess I'm Muppety.
It's pretty good. And it's me, Diana. Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hi. That's man, this segue is getting rough.
Yeah.
Good thing this is not a podcast about how to begin a podcast. It's actually a podcast about behavior analysis and a behavior analytic research. Every week, we pick a topic, discuss some relevant research articles, and sometimes we even do fun little extras within our episodes. And this is one of those episodes. So let's cut to the chase and get right to it. We had a great opportunity this summer to meet and interact with some folks from How to ABA, and we have them on tonight on this episode to talk with us all about ethics and common ethical questions new BCBAs and BCBA trainees often have. So we are very, very excited to have Shayna Gaunt and Shira Carpel from How to ABA with us today. Shayna and Shira, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Oh boy, well, we were very excited we got a chance to come on your show. I know I had audio technical issues, so no one had to listen to me very much. And this episode, we're very lucky to have you both on and to talk about some questions. You got some questions from folks, from some of your folks about ethics, and we're going to be talking about them and some updated kind of ethics articles we think are good ones to share. And that's really going to be it. So it's going to be a little bit of a Q&A. We usually do Q&A with our guests, but this one's going to be very question and then general discussion of answers oriented, all about ethics and some kind of initial ethical thoughts for folks out there and some questions that come up for practitioners.
Ethical thoughts is pretty funny.
Maybe we should just call that's the episode. Ethical Thoughts with How to ABA.
Remember that with Jack Handy? Remember that?
That's deep thoughts, though.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, deep. We got to call this deep ethical thoughts.
Deep ethical thoughts.
That's how the episode titles they get created. These great discussions. So,
all right.
Yeah, we love this topic because usually we're the ones hosting, our members asking us questions. So I think when we spoke about what we would talk about, it'd be interesting for us to get questions from you, representing what some of our members struggle with really in the field, which is what we do within our membership, is support our members and the people who are really struggling with a lot of these scenarios that are real practical, day-to-day stuff that come up. So we thought it would be cool to showcase it here.
That sounds awesome. Well, actually, before we talk about some of the articles and get into the questions, Shayna and Shira, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and yourselves and How to ABA?
Sure. I'm Shayna. I've been in the field for, 25 years now. I can't even believe it. Started off as a therapist and loved it so much. Then I became, I was one of the very first BCBAs in Canada. And it was a BCABA first and then a BCBA, and met Shira about 15 years ago. And it's been that long, Shira. Mm-hmm. And we established How to ABA back in 2017 already, because when we started out in the field, nobody was sharing anything. Everything seemed really like, this is my stuff, and I created it and I worked so hard on it, and I own it and I don't want to share with anybody else. And, we came across a lot of people with questions and, just a lot of people who wanted a community. And that's how we created How to ABA.
And I'll go next. I'm Shira. I actually first became a teacher, which I said I would never become. And then I taught for a couple years and was really looking for this solution that ABA kind of fell into my lap, because I was always kind of trying to figure out the students who didn't really quite fit in. So I ended up falling into ABA and met Shayna, became a BCBA. I've been a BCBA for a little over 10 years. I work now as the clinical director of a private special education school. And I'm the other half of How to ABA, like Shayna said, where we offer resources, support, community, and everything practical for like the working BCBA.
So, and Shira, you're also in Canada, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're both in Canada.
Jealous.
Could you speak a little bit about what it's like to be a BCBA in Canada? I mean, in terms of, talking with colleagues down in the US, does it seem very similar? Does it seem very different? Like, kind of what is the status? Because I mean, we're in Massachusetts, so Canada doesn't feel, it's like an 8-hour drive if we want to go to Quebec City or something, Toronto. So it feels like Canada is incredibly close, but we know that we don't want to just assume like, okay, it's just like America, because they're different countries with different backgrounds and histories.
Well, we don't live in an igloo and we don't have a dog sled. We do have ABA in Canada. There are a lot of BCBAs. I actually did my education through the University of Nevada, Reno, and I worked in New Jersey for a while. So I can compare Canada to the US quite closely. I would say when I worked in New Jersey back in 2000-ish, it was about 10 to 15 years ahead of where Canada was. I would say now Canada's caught up quite significantly. I think the major difference would be the funding model. So we don't have the insurance companies like the US does.
Which is a good thing and a bad thing, right? We kind of practice the science for the science. And so we're able to make decisions based on our ethical code and our task list and not as much based on insurance funding.
Is it in the public schools?
No.
Okay. So
they still separate ABA from the school system. That's why I get to work in a private school, which, we get to really merge the two, which is really nice. In public schools, it's still a little bit sticky in terms of them letting ABA practitioners into the public school and actually providing ABA in the school system. We're a little bit behind.
Oh, okay. Is it any kind of sense of what some of the barriers are? Like it's a teacher organization issue, or just the way laws have been structured? That
really
just
bureaucratic. Yeah. It's their, different ministries that fund different services. And right now the funding is for, if you have a diagnosis of autism, you can be eligible for a pretty significant amount of funding, but that funding is very specific, and it's very specific to the point where you can't even use it on school. They really want it to be used on therapies, all of those things, so that they really purposefully separate the two, probably more for like legal reasons.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Not in the best interest of the kids, which is what I love to talk about, because like I get to do both. So yeah, I think it should be for education.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that could lead into some ethical discussions in terms of you can provide ABA services for educational needs, but can you in certain situations? When is it legal? When is it ethical? But maybe we'll get into that one a little later, because you have to have a role, all that good stuff. Well, thank you for the update from up north, at least from where we're recording right now. It's always nice to hear more about other places and ABA in other locations. So with some introductions done, let's share kind of the articles we'll sort of be referring back and forth to, and then we'll get right into the questions for today.
Yeah, so like we had said, the most important part of this discussion today is really going to be surrounding the BACB ethics code. We're going to talk about some common situations that crop up according to the How to ABA listeners. And when you hear the scenarios, you'll be like, oh yeah, those are like definitely situations that either you've personally experienced or someone else has. But I wanted to make sure that we were tying things back into the literature as well. So I chose a few articles to kind of support our discussion. And the one that I think is most relevant would be this one: Disseminating Ethical Applied Behavior Analysis Within a Human Service Organization, a Tutorial, by Glodowski, Hockenberry, Anthony, and Hinckley. That was published in Behavior Analysis in Practice 2024. It's pretty new. It has some colorful diagrams included.
It's really pretty.
It is, right? It's a pretty article. And then to round that out, I listed 3 in the preview, but really I think these 2 are the ones that are germane to the discussion. So the other one is a preliminary assessment of the qualities and behaviors of exemplary practitioners, perspectives from U.S.-based behavior analysts. That's by Zayak, Van Straten, Ratkos, Williams, Geiger, and Pauk, and that was in Behavior Analysis in Practice 2021.
I love that one. One of my favorites.
I had not read or come across this article before this go-round, and I loved it too. I thought it was really cool, but I included it as well. I'll just go ahead and briefly talk about it here. So they asked several BCBAs, basically, what are important characteristics to have as a BCBA? And this, austere group of folks came up with 35 different skills or characteristics that they felt are important to be successful as a BCBA. And I'm going to quickly and they alphabetize them. So like, I love that. Right. But I'm going to quickly tell you what some of them are. Being able to advocate for ABA, all the 7 dimensions. Make sure you can do all of those. Be child-centered, be collaborative, be culturally competent, be data-driven, disseminate information, be an effective communicator, be an effective instructor, be efficient and organized, be empathetic, be ethical, be experienced, be flexible, be honest, be humble, be innovative, have interpersonal skills, and knowledgeable. And that's just the first half of the alphabet.
That was really good.
That's a very high standard for us.
Right? I know, that's the thing, right? And it's true, like everything on this list I totally agree with, but I also feel like as a brand new BCBA, you come in and let's say you got this list, right? And you're like, this is what I need to be. I need to be all of these things at once. And you're trying to learn how to do all of this at the same time while you're managing a caseload and maybe starting to supervise people and running parent meetings. And there's just so much going on there. So I feel like it can be so easy to get overwhelmed. Even though I agree with the list, it's just a lot. So I think recognizing that folks have big shoes that they see themselves needing to fill and how that can potentially contribute towards the stress of making some of these initial decisions, whether they're in the ethics realm or in just the realm of trying to learn how to do this really complex job.
Well, I mean, a caveat for new BCBAs who see this list and say, I got to do all of these if I want to be exemplary. No, this list, not everyone rated all of these high. So there's only like 10 to 20 you got to do. Maybe 15 you could get away with and still be considered exemplary. Plus, they only asked other BCBAs. And as much fun as it is to have other BCBAs think you're awesome at your job, at the end of the day, it's really your clients and their caregivers who matter the most. And I don't think they talk about doing that as a follow-up study. They have not done that study. So for all we know, you could be awesome at the top 10 things other BCBAs think, and nobody else thinks you are all that.
Yeah.
So,
well,
and certainly,
I think the one that I liked in the top 10 actually was the one that strives to be a better behavior analyst. Because I think if you can get that one, then you don't have to have all the other ones. And I think it's actually, we also ask a lot of our guests on our podcast, what would you recommend, or, a newly minted BCBA? And most of the time it has to do with that. It's like, just continue to grow, continue to try and be better, because if you have that, then eventually, you may not start out being super efficient, but you'll learn that. And I think that's a really important skill.
Yeah.
Totally. And then speaking of generality of the study, it was only US based behavior analysts. So we have no idea.
Might be different up here.
Would be. Right, exactly. So it's ripe for replication.
I was a little sad that one of the least important skills was being able to disseminate behavior analysis, which is like, man, I just spent 8 years oppressing no one, I guess. So a little sad about that.
The interesting thing, though, they did say effective communicator and interpersonal skills. So, Rob, if you want to take that one, like number 10, effective communicator, take that one instead.
Okay.
There to December.
All right.
You got it.
You talked me down. You talked me down, Shana. Thank you. Oh, good. All right. So this big, long list. Don't worry. You don't have to do them all. We'll talk about some of the ones that we talked about some of the ones we liked a little later. All right. So these were questions that were sent in from How to ABA listeners. So we're just going to get started with number 1.
Can we ask what exactly was the prompt?
What was the prompt? What was the prompt? Good idea.
Oh, it was probably something like, tell us about your everyday ethical challenges.
There you go.
It's a good prompt.
It's a good prompt.
Yeah.
That's how I start my ethics class every week.
Oh.
What sort of ethical challenges or successes have you come up with? And it is interesting what you can hear. And I'm like, please don't tell me the company.
We have a monthly mentorship meeting, and we start off every meeting with, tell us about your successes of the week. But we should also start talking about ethics because they're huge. We got a lot of responses and almost immediate responses from our members. It's something that, it's talked about in articles, but a lot of it has to do with supervision and my supervisor, supervisee. And these are more practical related things like, well, in my workplace, this is what's happening. And like you said, please don't tell me where you work, but let's talk about this.
I also like to bring up the point that it is part of the ethics code to talk about ethics during supervision. Right? So we should be talking about ethics in all of our supervision meetings if we can, at least monthly. So if you are a supervisor and you're engaging in individual or group supervision, you should be including a question about ethics, either learning about ethics or discussing ethics in every single one of your, or as many as you can of your supervision meetings, as it is part of the ethical requirement to being a good supervisor.
So I want actually going to start, get rid of question one. I'm asking question one here for everybody. How do you prep your trainees or supervisees to talk fluently about ethical problems? Because one of the challenges I used to find, I think I've come up with some solutions that have worked for me over the years for folks I supervise. But one of the problems is when we talk about ethics with people who are new to the field, I think it becomes very much, well, I didn't like push anyone in front of a car or like steal money, so I don't have any ethical concerns this week. And it takes such a long time to get to really breaking down how easy it is. I think it was.
No. Even then, you could be talking about the trolley problem.
That's true. But what do folks do to sort of get people sort of primed to have more meaningful discussion? Not that it's not meaningful to, literally do no harm, but to really have some of those more complex ethical discussions, or to teach your supervisees and trainees how to even identify the more subtle ethical breaches.
I think that's a great question. It's something that I definitely have to be more, aware of, because it should come up more often in terms of like, let's talk about it again and tell me what you've experienced. What I try to do sometimes is the modeling. Like I'll talk about something that I've been experiencing in some of our meetings or something that's come up for me. Then it's always a fine line of like, how much do you tell your supervisee and how much do you not? But I think just talking about things as they're coming up, because it's not an intuitive awareness. You're kind of making them aware of what they need to be aware of, which comes from, I think, a lot of just hearing it and talking about it and modeling it for me. And so that eventually they start to see it in their everyday.
The other thing, too, would be to normalize it. So, ethical challenges aren't supposed to be a slap on the wrist. I mean, obviously, if you've broken the code, there's repercussions. But being able to talk about something that came up doesn't mean that you did the wrong thing. There's, lots of ways. It's like, hey, let's talk about this so that you don't do the wrong thing. And really being able to normalize it and saying, everyone goes through this. Everyone has ethical dilemmas at work. You wouldn't be a behavior analyst or an ABA professional if you weren't experiencing some of these things.
I like both of those ideas. Certainly the modeling it, the talking about your own background, and trying to normalizing the discussions, I think is great. Jackie or Diana, anything else?
One thing that I do is so I print them off for everyone first and foremost, so that everyone has them, right? So they can't be like, I print the code off. And then for, in my class, it's part of class, right? So we have lots of, scenarios that we will walk through that may or may not be real, that I've found from like the Arizona ABA has an ethics archive. Their association has an ethics archive. Behavior Analysis and Practice has an ethics archive where there's scenarios, so I can use some of those scenarios. A lot of the ethics textbooks have scenarios that we would pull out. But another thing I love to do is when I'm doing group supervision, I will have like a standards month. So I'll have like the students just focus on one standard, like standard 1. And then each week we'll be like, okay, anything happen in standard 1, right? And then, a lot of the times it's deciphering if it's an ethical issue, if it's like just an icky issue, right? Maybe it's not ethical, but it feels icky, or if it's a legal issue. So kind of going through that, and everyone has to come up with something, even if it's like, I thought about accepting a Starbucks gift card that was $11, right? And like, where do you go there, right? Because we're only allowed to accept $10 or
the $11 gift card.
The $11 gift card, right?
That sounds like an ethics trap. Like,
well, as a Canadian, am I allowed to accept a $10 US gift card or only a $10 Canadian gift card?
It'll really depend on the currency level at that time, right?
What's ethical today could not be ethical tomorrow based on inflation,
But that, it's like those things that will just focus on a standard for a month. And that really allows students and supervisees to really dig deep and ask all of what they think are dumb questions, which are absolutely not dumb questions, about those standards.
Smart.
I think that's such a great idea also, because when we learn about ethics from the code, you think of it in like hard, like black and white, terrible things are happening. So obviously, like, I'm going to report that because somebody is like, doing something terrible. But when you talk about it more, it's really just the nuanced things. It's like, it's not so clear that this is obviously an ethical rule, because there's so much gray in between, like, what is ethical. And so I think having the discussions maybe around a certain topic really bring up those ideas that, like, the code makes it sound like extreme, like it either is ethical or it's not. But in real life practice, it's about those little, nuance.
And the last thing I want to say, the last thing I want to say is that the 2022 code, I think, does a better job than the previous codes of making it feel like everybody's going to jail, right? If you do something wrong, or you're instantly going to lose your, you're instantly going to lose your BACB certification if you've taken that $11 gift card, because they offer that flow chart in the introduction now. And they do specifically say that there are times where you will have to violate the code, but if you can document why and how you violated the code and keep that, so that if someone does decide to be that person, that then you can submit that documentation to BACB, because one of the biggest problems with the old code prior to 2022 is that many of the code standards clash with one another, right? So you could be following one, but also breaking another. So I love that the flowchart with the new code really allows BCBAs to be thoughtful in their decisions and not being like, okay, it's $11. If I take this, then I'm violating that code. But then I also am ruining the relationship with the client because they accidentally bought an $11 one and then a $10 one. So you document that, right? And then if someone is going to be like that, if they're going to be that petty and submit some documentation to the BACB, you can support your rationale, and the BACB will accept that, which I really appreciate.
I think the biggest thing you said, Jackie, is documentation. And I think that's, as a BCBA, we all get so busy and we forget a lot of things. And, an ethical issue comes up and you may do the right thing and you may seek some guidance from somebody else and talk to somebody else about it, but then you don't write it down. You forget about it. And then 3 months go by, 4 months go by, and then something else happens. So that documentation piece is huge. And that's throughout the code. If you read, every little, section of the code, almost every one says, and document. And document, and document. And we need to make sure we're doing that.
Mm-hmm. I think, Shannon, speaking of documentation, I can't remember if it was explicitly noted in terms of discussing systems, but I know looking at the Glodowski article was so big on organizational, which I'm so glad we got a chance to we're going to get a chance to keep talking about this article. I get a chance to, read this article because I'd missed this one. Certainly I read the Valentino article from before, but this is a newer one. And I just love the idea of, hey, everybody, as much as you as an individual need to be really thinking about your ethical responsibility, if you work in a place that doesn't care at all about your ethics, it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, to actually perform ethical behavior in your work. So I really just love this idea of just, again, beating home the point of, if you're an organization and you're not thinking about things like, what should the documentation look like? Could we give people documentation to keep track of ethical issues? Is it part of our ongoing system? Just to make it as easy as possible for people to behave ethically. But that would be one where I would love to be in a place where they're like, oh, yeah, did you have an ethical discussion? Great. Here's our ethical memo. Just jot down some things you did. And even anything like that would be so helpful for remembering. I got to write this down, as opposed to, I think I did this. Maybe I did. I don't remember now. What's that? Ethical complaint against me? Ooh.
Right. Yeah. Glodowski's article was really great. And I actually went back. I had read Valentino's before. I'd read Linda LeBlanc's before, but it was really great. And I actually did go back and brush up on those studies as well. I had Dr. LeBlanc as a university professor, and she is wonderful. Awesome. And I continue to follow her. I go to conferences just to see her, and I take online CEUs just to be near her. That's creepy, isn't it? Anyway, with that being said, she was the first to document and talk about this decision-making process and putting this in a human service agency. And, then Valentino updated that with the new code, and Valentino and LeBlanc worked closely together. And then Glodowski took it one step further and, did that follow-up study. And I love it because all of these articles now are talking about this more and more and more. And I think the next step that needs to happen is, this all sounds like these are from larger organizations. And how do we put this in place with a smaller organization? We have members out there who are, just setting up shop, and, they're a 2-person show, or they're, in a very small company right now. And I think the next step of these articles needs to be, how do we put some type of ethical model within a really tiny organization?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the size also makes me think of, I know Matt Broadhead and colleagues had an article about ethics, having an ethics coordinator, which I think might be hard if you don't have a lot of employees, but that almost feels like it might be a better fit. Or taking some of the lessons from LeBlanc and Valentino and Glodowski, and then maybe just sort of condensing who's involved and like getting the groups together to talk about ethics. Like, I wonder if that could be a solution. But again, I don't know. I'm not in a small organization. I'm in the school system, so people love it when I talk to them about my BCBA ethics code. I got like 5 other people who are like, "Oh, I know what that is." Everyone else sort of like, "Thanks." Oh, all right. So now that was my question. Let's get on to some of the How to ABA listener questions. And I definitely loved the lived-in feel of all of these scenarios. They feel very real, which then makes them a little scary to talk about, because they're all ones that have happened, I think, probably to all of us in some form or another. The first one: my employer asked me to increase hours with 2 of my clients. The clients could have used the extra hours, but I did not feel comfortable doing this because I did not have the time. My caseload was already very tight.
What do you do?
Now what? Anyway, moving on. Next question.
I don't know. Let's skip that one. Can we skip that one? Just kidding. I mean, it's tough, right? The code says that we have a responsibility to our clients, right? 3.01 of the code. And if you're an RBT, it's, 3.12 of the RBT code is advocating for appropriate services for your client. But I think we need to define what the responsibility to our clients is. Sure, they may need more hours, but if you don't have the time to provide those hours or provide the appropriate supervision, what's the quality of those hours going to be like? And I think we need to look at that quality over quantity if we don't have that time. And I think that we really do need to go back to, what are the examples of an effective BCBA? One of those is communication, being able to communicate with your employer and saying, I don't have the time to increase these hours. Is there another BCBA who can, take one of these clients and I'll take the other client, or help me out, or something along those lines?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of discussion amongst BCBAs about this caseload, and everyone's asking about what should a typical caseload be. And that's like kind of the first question I get asked when I interview people is about caseload. And I think it really depends it's hard to put a number on it sometimes. And sometimes it depends on like what's going on with the client, or how many hours they're getting services for, or what your responsibilities are. So I think it's more than just a number of 2 clients who need more hours. I think you have to look at the big picture. And sometimes it's even easier to take one client who needs more hours versus a whole new client, because like it's much easier to supervise more hours with the same client. So I think it depends. And I do think that BCBAs shouldn't get too stuck with the caseload number and really think bigger in terms of like what's best for the client, what's best for sometimes the organization, or, there's more than just the number of cases.
Mm-hmm.
It also really depends on how experienced a BCBA is. I mean, if you're doing an initial assessment, I do initial assessments a lot, and I can do them fairly quickly and accurately because I've been doing them for 20 years. Somebody who's been coming into the field and has 6 months of experience doing an assessment is going to take a lot longer to do that. And, just to write up a whole initial program outline and everything else. So again, it really does. It is based on experience as well and how much you can do. But as you're taking on new clients, whether it's a new client, whether it's, the code talks about supervisory volume, that's more of a supervisee versus supervisor. But, anytime you're asked to take on anything new to your caseload, it's not just looking at like, okay, so there's 2 more billable hours or 5 more billable hours, but what are those non-billable hours, right? Because sometimes there's travel involved. Sometimes there's, phone calls at night versus, or emails to return that, this person, writes lengthy emails and always expects a response within, a certain amount of time. And this happens. Whereas you have other clients who don't require that level of, what's the word I'm looking for? They don't require that level of work or that level of communication necessarily. You put your 2 hours in and, they're center based and you want to talk to the client or the stakeholder, and the stakeholder doesn't even return your emails, right? Whereas another stakeholder might be very, very involved. So you have to factor that in as well when you're talking about taking on a new client or increasing hours.
Mm-hmm. One thing that didn't sound like was a challenge for the individual who asked this question, but I'm thinking about for folks who have lots of clients that sort of are in these sort of weird amorphous roles as a BCBA. What exactly is their role? So like 1.04, if they don't have a clear role or they're sort of overseeing a lot of aspects of a case, I think it could be really easy to find yourself in a situation where, yes, the client does need more hours because I guess I'm in charge of things that I didn't think I was in charge of, which is going to bring up issues related to competence, is going to bring up issues related to appropriate caseload. So that could be another wrinkle in there of what is actually your responsibility to the client. And does your boss disagree as to what your responsibility is? Like, was that never well defined and now you're sort of in the middle of the case?
I really do think that university has to get better at teaching courses on communication. Mm-hmm. And having we have full courses on ethics, which is hugely needed, but having courses on literally communication, how to communicate with employers, how to communicate with your colleagues, how to communicate with stakeholders, because that is huge. And we just are supposed to just learn that on the job. Sure, if you have a really great supervisor, your supervisor is going to teach you, but that's not even required in the BACB task list. And if you are an effective communicator, to me, the very first thing I thought of when I read that question was, well, you go to your boss and you talk it out, but not everybody can do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's the good, can we role play for a second? Because I think my first thought when, I think most of us, especially if we're having a bad day or it's the end of a day, we're at night and we were doing some traveling today. So we're all a little tired. So if someone said, hey, you got to add more hours, I would be hard pressed until maybe tomorrow morning to say anything other than I got too much to do, which is not the same as explaining, well, here's my caseload. Here are my concerns. Here are the ethical codes. So, I mean, what might that look like if you were to go to your supervisor, your boss, to explain the situation? Like, does anyone want to give it a shot?
I will. I mean, I owned 3 clinics for a long time. And so I was the boss, but I was more than the boss. I was the boss. I was the BCBA. I hired another BCBA. I was the colleague. I was a lot of different roles because I had to be. And, people would come to me, and I had I had really great employees. They were fabulous, but we taught each other how to communicate. And one of my biggest pet peeves was when people would come to me as I'm on my way to do something else. So I'm on my way to go see a client, or I'm, taking a phone call or just got off the phone, and someone's like, oh, hey, Shayna, this. And I'm like, well, wait a second. So I think the very first step in effective communication is determining a time that is appropriate. So, sending your employer an email or your supervisor, saying, hey, when's a good time to talk, and actually finding a time that works versus doing it on the fly. That is the very first thing, number one. And number two, doing it alone. You instead of, them being with a group or in a big, doing it one-to-one so that it can feel a little bit more private, a little bit more personal would be the biggest thing. And if you do those 2 things, I think the other things will come and set yourself up for success.
Oh, I like those. Those are prerequisite skills. I wasn't even thinking. I was like, well, what are the words? But no, you're right. Uh-huh. Quick email, do it alone. Probably going to be okay.
Antecedent strategies here, Rob.
Please, anyhow, I love those. Those are the easiest ones. They work so well most of the time too.
That's really good advice, and I think having an ongoing rapport and opportunity to meet with your boss or whoever your supervising BCBA might be, if you're a new BCBA, is really critical. Because, like in this scenario, it's just 2 extra hours, right? And so everyone, especially if you're new, you might not think about all those extra pieces that you were saying. And they say, oh, it's 2 more hours, I can do that. But until you speak up and say, actually, I think I'm at my limit time-wise with what I can do and do a good job at, then you're just going to keep getting those requests of adding more and more little by little. So having that avenue of communication open and knowing that you can, bring those things up to your boss is really important so that you can keep providing good quality care ethically.
Yeah, and also from a supervisor or manager, when I offer more hours to one of my BCBAs, it's genuinely not from a place of like, you need to take these hours. I don't know what their caseload is like. I don't know necessarily what they feel like they can take on more or not. I want to be able to offer it to them. So I think, I'll have the ones who come back to me with, thanks a lot, but my plate is full. Totally fine. Have that open communication. But I wouldn't want them to come back like feeling like resentful that I offered it to them, because you have to see it from, both sides. And while one side is feeling burdened, I really just genuinely want to help them. So kind of just having that balance of communication is the best solution.
And it goes back to that Zayek article again, right? What is an exemplary behavior analysis? An effective communicator.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Now, what about the flip side? I'm assuming it was the same listener, but then asked, conversely, what if your employer wanted you to recommend more hours and time was no longer the issue? You have the time to supervise, but you didn't think it was medically necessary nor supported by the assessments, by your FBA. So the pressure's on, get more hours, but you have no clinical reason, no data-based reason to add extra hours. The client's making effective progress, for example.
Mm-hmm. So we actually encounter this too often here in Canada because of the way the funding is, and more, not so much how it is currently, but how it used to be, where the BCBA was the business owner and the program director and the one recommending the hours for funding. And there's a huge conflict in that, because I'm running the business. Why wouldn't I recommend the most amount of hours? And that used to be how hours were determined. It's not the case anymore.
Sure. It was determined by, does the owner need like an addition on their house or a new roof? Totally. And then the hours would come out there.
Yeah, and it would be granted based on, and you didn't even need much to back it up, like there was no, something about proving medical necessity. We didn't really have that. So they've changed that model to be one that is more, I guess, parent supported. So parents can request the amount of hours and parents are getting the funding. And we do come up with this a lot because often parents will want more hours than we may think that the child needs, or they may get more funding for hours than they need. And I actually think that it really depends on what the alternative is. I know we looked into what is, medical necessity? What is that number of hours? I don't know if there's a magic number. We couldn't really find much on support on the number of hours that are medically necessary. But I think this comes back to seeing the big picture and what's really going on, that when this child isn't with you in a clinic, or what does your clinic look like? For me, it's really just education. So if a kid is in education all day and we're calling that ABA, or they do a couple extra hours of ABA after school, it's not really harmful. We're doing what's in the best interest of the client. You're seeing the big picture. You're getting all stakeholders involved. So I would think if they're making progress and everyone's on board, kind of the more the merrier, if it's in the right kind of arrangement. If it's pulling the child out of school and they're not having socialization and there's all these other, cons or downsides to this, then you obviously have to consider that. But that was my thought on this. I think Shane may have had a different perspective.
Her and I actually talked about this one for a while because we did have differing opinions. And, for me, we have to advocate for our clients, period. And that's what our code says is, client. And, there are certain aspects. I agree with Shira in the fact that, well, if the client's sitting around on an iPad and doing nothing, then being engaged with an ABA therapist is way better than doing nothing. But again, it depends the way the insurance and everything works as well, because if you're putting in extra insurance hours, that's fraud. You can't do that. But if it's, if you say, no, I think my client needs X amount of hours, making sure that you're basing that on data, documenting your decision. And if your employer still wants to go ahead and give more hours, then you have a duty to report, right? So you have to report that to the insurance company, to the BACB, and making sure that you document that you weren't in agreement with that.
Within 6 months, too.
Yeah.
You can't wait, right? If it's after 6 months, they may not accept it.
So that's section 1.16 of the code, self-reporting critical information.
Oof. I know that one.
If it would be different in the States for you guys.
In terms of the self-reporting insurance, I think that was pretty similar.
Yeah.
No, not the code one, but
question.
Recommending hours.
I mean, there's a lot of big companies now, right, who've taken over, and it's more about billing than it is about the client. Well, some companies, right? How is it with all of you?
Yeah, I mean, that does still happen. But I think the BCBA then has to, advocate for their clients, demonstrate data, and then report as necessary, right?
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
Hey everybody, sorry to pause the conversation, but I wanted to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. So by listening to this episode, you are able to earn 1 Ethics CE. All you need to do is finish listening to our discussion with Shayna and Shira, and then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, or click the link in your podcast notes section. You are going to need some key information about yourself, your certification number, and 2 code words that are sprinkled throughout the episode. These are special guest code words from the How to ABA folks. I'm going to give you the first one right now. It is Ski Racer. SKIRACER. You can make it 1 word or 2. Ski Racer.
Sure, that's fine.
Someone who races.
Yeah. Just have
on
your
skis.
height, eye color, social security number, birthplace ready for us as well.
But no, that's ridiculous.
You don't need that information?
Not that. I mean, you can leave it if you want. You can email us that stuff if you really want to. But we don't need that. Just some of the stuff you need.
Maybe I should listen to this episode on ethics.
Probably. Ski Racer. All right, let's get back to the discussion. We've talked a lot about documentation. I think this is definitely an area where I feel more comfortable when I see that documentation. And some of it is, ethically necessary, clinically necessary. Show me your behavior assessment. And I feel much more strongly when folks show me that they've done, maybe an analog FA, they've done an ISCA, they've done something that really analyzed data rather than, I did a fast, I asked a couple people, and I watched a few times, it's probably this. Therefore, they need 40 hours a week. That doesn't feel very coherent. It feels like they've just slapped a number onto a sloppy assessment. Or maybe it was a good assessment too, but could it have been more thorough? Right? It's not giving me the information I want. I think the more data people are sharing in terms of student progress, proposed programs, I think it makes it a lot easier to sort of semi-quantify. If you are going to use these types of programs, my evidence base, mostly based on my own experiences, those tend to take, 2 to 3 hours. And depending on how much support they're getting at school, at home, in the community, you would do more, you would do less. And if you've documented all that, I think it's I don't want to say very easy, but I think it's a lot more concrete to make a case of how much time is needed to meet these goals. So again, I think the more documentation, the more upfront we are with sharing that information. I mean, those are ethical requirements too, right? Are we explaining assessments in a way that all stakeholders understand what it is we're proposing and why? And if anyone has those questions, can you answer them? And if I say, 40 seems a lot, or 20 seems low, or 5 seems low, or 5 seems a lot, how did you come up with that? And you can't give me a general sense of your math. I'm going to question whether or not you are really thinking about the client's best interests or some other factor. Again, that doesn't make it an ethical concern. That's just my personal concern. But I'd rather have no ethical concerns or personal concerns than, hope that a personal concern doesn't turn into an ethical concern.
Right.
All right. We've got some scenarios here some tough scenarios about working in client homes as well. So there's a couple examples here of folks sort of working in areas. I'll be a little more sort of vague with the details because I certainly don't want to, us to give the impression that we're giving specific advice. If you see blank, you should do it,
Smart.
something else.
Yeah.
But if you are, let's say, an RBT or a BCBA, and you are working in a home where there are signs of safety, maybe it's health and wellness, maybe it's parents seeming impaired, maybe it's parents acting in ways that are different than their typical baseline, sort of signaling something might be wrong, whether it's something that, related to maybe an intoxication or an injury or home stressors that are just changing patterns of behavior. When do you pull the services? Or when do you, say, I can't start the services? When is it okay to tell a family you got to clean up your act X, Y, and Z ways before I will give you services? Is it okay to do that? When is the safety of the RBT or BCBA paramount? When does that take precedence? How do we know it takes precedence?
All good questions.
They're not mine. I just added that, these are your listeners. This is a great question. I added a couple more.
I worked in home base for many, many years. So I didn't experience anything this extreme, but definitely experienced things where like you're feeling like a little, icky about what's going on. And it's important to ask these questions because it's not really a fine line, or it's not like black and white. So I think that the best thing would be if you go into any service, especially a service at home, where you have very clear parameters. And this is where service contracts, you kind of, at least for me, I'm kind of always learning what I need to add into my service contract as these situations come up. So I'm constantly tweaking it and adding to it. Oh, that's a good thing I need to put in there. I never would have thought of that. So your service contract ideally is addressing a lot of these things, missed sessions, parents, not being available or not being home, or somebody does need to be home when they're getting services. All of these things would hopefully be addressed in the service contract, which means that you hopefully wouldn't start services if those weren't in place. And if services, you have a probation period often with home-based services. And if they weren't meeting some of those service contracts, then, you'd give them the notice or whatever is in the contract. That's when it's all, nice and clean. Sometimes the things come up that aren't part of that service contract. And I think the most important thing is safety for the child, safety for the professionals who are working there. And if you are, suspicious that something might be unsafe, we have a responsibility to the clients and responsibility to our therapists to report it.
I think in terms of like report, what's the reporting? I mean, I assume in Canada, similar, you sort of have like a role of like mandated reporters depending on human services. Okay, so it's pretty clear rules.
You have to report it in that way. Yeah. I don't know what it's called in the States.
Yeah, mandated reporter is
No, report it to who?
It depends. I mean, certainly if it's a legal issue, you report to the police or to other authorities.
It's called different things in different states.
Yeah.
In our state, it's DCF.
That's the group you would report to.
Department of Children and Families. But everywhere it has a different name, of course. I really liked the phrasing that you used, which says, if a parent can compromise the safety of the RBT, then they can also compromise the safety of the child. Mm-hmm. So if anyone is concerned for anyone's safety, then it is likely that you should be reporting that situation.
Mm.
I also, as an RBT, you're working under a BCBA. You have to be working under a BCBA. So already you're a team. You're at least a team of two. So if there's anything off in a home, and I mean, I've done home therapy for years as well, and it can be really rewarding, but it can also be tough. You go into a whole bunch of different homes, you're seeing a whole bunch of different things, cultural diversity, biases come into play. There's a lot of that as well. But if there's anything that you feel is just off, you can't define it. There's just your spidey senses are going off and you're okay, there's something odd about this situation. You don't know whether you should report or not. You know you have a duty to report, but you're not quite sure if it is a situation where you need to do that. You talk to your team, talk to your BCBA, talk to another person on your team about it, first off. Secondly, then, ask yourself, is it a safety issue? If it's a safety issue, 100%, you need to pick up that phone, you need to report. But if you've got a team, like I said, your RBT, BCBA, employer, have that conversation. And sometimes it might be a solution where it's not about the safety of a child, but it might be something that, the parents just can't swing home therapy for whatever reason. And maybe it's just the solution is, hey, we can get therapy in a different environment. And that might be the solution. So there might be other ways to do that. In terms of your responsibility to the clients, your client can still get therapy. It might just need to look a little bit more creative.
And I think there's so many situations where, like you were saying, you're not sure. And it does damage your relationship to a parent if you do report that. And you shouldn't have, that's going to not go well at all. So we do have to be careful about what we are reporting, that it really does need to be a safety issue, but that doesn't mean there isn't a solution for when you're just not sure. There are people to ask, there are hopefully, you could refer them to, our community has different social work type people that can help. You could refer them to different agencies. You could, get them to go to a center, any one of those things, and then collect the data, document things, because one little thing might just make you feel a little suspicious. But if that's happening over and over and over again, we look for trends, and that might be, once you see it documented, a little bit more eye-opening as to what the right next step is.
I've actually called Children's Aid a few times, and not specifically about a client, but about a question. So, call them in general, hi, I'm just calling anonymously. This situation happened. Is this a duty to report? And sometimes they'll say, no, it's not, or do this instead. Or they'll say, yes, it is, and we can get some help for these people, and okay, and then I will report. But it's nice because you can call and just ask those questions. I actually went in with a parent one time, and there was an office near the parents' house. And she had questions about her son staying home alone. And we wanted to teach this as an ABA program. Can he stay at home? And he had severe impairments, and I didn't know the answer to that. So we literally walked into the office, and the three of us, meaning the caseworker and, me and the stakeholder, talked it out and came up with all these parameters. If you can teach the person this, and this, then yes. And if you can document that, then yes. But if not, so they were actually really helpful. And I think a lot of the time, we think, I can't be calling Children's Aid because, oh no. And you can work with them, and they're actually really amazing.
That's good to know, because I think most folks, when they think about calling those numbers or those hotlines, it very much is, I have to tell on somebody, someone's going to get in big trouble. But is there room for information, for gaining information and understanding of a situation better through those collaborative efforts? Oh boy, your listeners did not disappoint with some of these questions. We're gonna move on to one of my least favorite, in that I always find these to be very complicated myself, and they're very hard to extricate. And boy, if you thought that the ethical code was in line with, say, laws in your area about multiple relationships, no, not really. They're kind of all over the place, at least in Massachusetts. There's similarities, but there are differences. There's exceptions. So this is one that I see everyone, widely struggle with, and I'm not surprised other people would be struggling with them. So again, I don't want to give too specific examples from some of your listeners, but some general patterns of multiple relationships, or as I'm not sure whether it was one of you or one of the listeners, Linda LeBlanc, quote, dual relationships where you least expect them.
Linda LeBlanc's article was just giving examples of some of the ethics talks that she did, and I thought it was one of them. And I thought that was really great. I got
really good, because it's not like I planned to have this happen. It's just it suddenly appeared.
All right. I'm picturing Buzz Lightyear when he's holding his arm out and he's dual relationships everywhere.
To infinity and beyond.
Yes, exactly.
So there's a couple kind of dual relationships where least expected. One is sort of the more standard, I think. I'm delivering services to somebody, and they happen to provide a different service. And either because I needed help with that service, or because they were very adamant that they would help me with the service they provided, they did extra work for me pro bono. However, how do you demonstrate that is not because of the work you're doing with the family? So, for example, if you work with a family that, say, has a restaurant, they're giving you a lot of free meals, right? Is that, how do you get out of a multiple relationship or avoid getting into one? And then a follow-up question was one actually from an RBT. What do you do if you're an RBT and your BCBA supervisor is not modeling maintaining appropriate relationships and putting you in the odd situation where now you're the bad guy who won't play along? Which kind of sounds like a 70s cop movie where all the cops are dirty cops and oh, that guy's not on the take. Kind of reminds me of that situation.
Starring Ashton Kutcher.
So how do you, what do you do when you have families that are trying to be helpful and are getting you into a multiple relationship.
Contracts.
Yeah, and you would have
BACB
foreseen all of these things, and they're in the contract.
Right. So the BACB doesn't specifically prohibit bartering or trading goods for services. That was in the newsletter. So that was in a recent newsletter. They do not prohibit that. But they do say that it is not recommended, right? Because you can't quantify quality of services, right? But they do say that if you do that, you need to have a pretty stringent contract in place.
Hmm.
And I think it's a little bit more straightforward when it's like service for service, both services end or whatever it is you're exchanging. You have a contract in place and like nothing really could come of it. Like, you go to a restaurant, you eat the meal, like the chances of something coming back from that are pretty slim. You should still have the contract in place. And you always want to be thinking like 10 steps ahead. Like, what could possibly arise out of this kind of situation? I think it gets a lot trickier when a dual relationship is someone that you are providing a service to, like ABA, or they become your client. That gets a lot stickier. And those are ones that I would stay further away from, because 10 steps down the road, you cannot predict what that's going to look like, or what kind of services the client's going to need, or what kind of situations you're going to get in with a family member, or with a coworker, or with things that really would present real ethical issues. So I would stay away from those, multiple relationships when it comes to servicing a client. And then, like Jackie said, if it's something that's really just an exchange of services as a one-off, having a contract in place, like maybe it doesn't seem like such a big deal to me.
Mm.
I think it depends what those services are. If it's like, okay, so, and if you're paying for those services, so, okay, hey, I live in a small town and you're the only deal in town, and I need to buy my tires through you because you're one of one service providers for tires. I need to go to you. If you're one of 20,
the barber,
or the barber, right? Like, if you're one of 20 service providers for tires, you'd love to support your client. And if you're going to pay, then go to them. But if you're not going to pay, and what happens if there's a problem with those tires, then that's where Shira's talking about. You've got to think 6 steps ahead or 10 steps ahead, because if there are issues with a haircut, no big deal. You look terrible for a while, but it grows back. But if there's issues with a tire and you keep having to go back and forth, then that's an issue.
Mm-hmm. And what about the RBT in this situation? So, certainly I think it's one thing when you don't have the power in a situation to know that an ethical situation has occurred and ethics have been broken or violated. But what do you do when you are counting on that person to continue supervising you? I mean, I guess you hope you're in an organization that has an ethics network that you can write into the ethics group, and the ethics leader, they'll look at that. But is this a situation where you're just going to have to, report to the BACB, have that uncomfortable talk, and then just hope it doesn't result in some sort of, bad relationship afterwards? Or
I think before any reporting, especially in this situation, back to open communication, like have that conversation the same way we're having this conversation. We don't know what those factors are. Understand why the BCBA made that decision. Maybe it's a small town. Maybe it was, they paid for the services. Maybe there was something you don't understand, but approach it for the RBT. Approach it not like accusatory. Don't come to the BCBA with a tone of like, how dare you, break this code, but like with some curiosity, like, I'm, just wondering, I'm learning, and here's this code and here's what happened. And I'd love to understand your reasoning for this. Hopefully they could come to a place where either the BCBA acknowledges that maybe they should have done something differently, or maybe the RBT understands why the BCBA made that decision, and they could both learn from there, right? The willingness to continue to grow as a BCBA was one of the top 10.
That's
and
right.
We're not perfect. So we can't always make the right decision, and understanding and learning from that is important.
Mm. Oh. So let's do, I have one more kind of example of multiple relationship that sort of came up in some of the scenarios that have been brought up. And it's what do I do when somebody in our employ or another teammate is maintaining relationships with families that are no longer clients of the organization, or potentially they're clients of the organization, but are no longer clients under the care of the BCBA or potentially the RBT or behavior therapist?
Yes. That one comes up a lot.
This is a good one.
Mhm.
Yeah. If this person is an RBT and they do have their ethical code to abide by, then I think that you would definitely bring it up. I would start again by bringing it up with the RBT and letting them know that here's what's going on. Maybe I don't have all the information. Maybe you can explain something. Maybe there's something going on that I don't understand. And having that conversation with them. If they're not an RBT, it gets a little bit trickier because they don't have any kind of code or anything. So I don't know if there's much you can do in that case. Jana, what do you think?
Well, I was going to say, if you have a contract, I don't know whether, what the situation is, whether the client is a previous client and the RBT is a previous RBT of the organization, or whether the client is still a current client. But if the client is still a current client, or even if they're not, in your service contract, what does it say? Does it say that you can hire BC or RBTs from your organization, or is there a certain time period that needs to pass first? So going back to that initial service contract and looking at what's in there. And then, like Shira said, communication. And I feel like we keep going back to this. It's all about communication and documentation, but, being able to have that open communication with the RBT and maybe with that client as well. And just saying, hey, and again, not an accusatory tone, but hey, I understand that this is happening. What's the backstory on this? Is there something that we're doing that you don't trust us on, and that's why you're seeking help? Or how can we improve the situation so that you come to me and not to that old RBT?
I like that. I'm going to use that. I've certainly had plenty of those, not exactly horror stories, but I've had a lot of those reports working in schools for many, many years of folks who sort of don't quite understand what their position is, their role with the family past a certain point is. And
it wasn't just maintaining contact with the family. It was providing advice to the family on current behavioral objectives and programming.
I think that's one of those, this person says, that person says situations.
Because that's when it starts getting super ethically treacherous, I would say. So just to add that piece of clarification.
Yeah, but finding out the backstory on that, I'm not excusing that, because the RBT should not be offering advice. And that is, I would be reporting that to the board if I'm hearing that after I have a conversation with the RBT. But it's finding out from the family why they feel like they need to get that advice from the RBT. Am I not doing my job appropriately? And how can I improve? And how can I become a more effective behavior analyst? What do you want to see from me? Because it sounds to me like you trust the RBT more than you trust me. And I wouldn't say that in an accusatory way at all, but I need to find out what I can be doing better.
Yeah. I think one thing that also would add a wrinkle to it, what if it is a long period of time after there was a working relationship, and maybe that BT or RBT sort of, they found me on Facebook, or I saw them post something and we sort of just touched base, and it had been a long time. We just became friends unrelated to the service, which was maybe years and years ago. They might not know enough to say, this is me being a friend versus this is me giving professional advice. They might not even know I should have reported this relationship because it's been a long time.
Or the RBT might not even be an RBT anymore. There's nothing to report.
Yeah. Those are the tricky ones, when there's something to report, but there's actually nothing to report at the same time. Ugh.
Right?
But if they are now a BCBA, then they should not be providing advice to non-clients.
That would be an easier conversation to have, I hope. All right. I think this is going to be kind of our last question. I'm going to sort of lump a couple together again into kind of a little bit of a broader category. But what should one do when they are kind of privy to, they're a member of a team where they serve a role, and they're privy to somebody else in that group doing something that is, in their opinion, inappropriate, unethical, not clinically indicated? So, for example, some of the examples your listeners gave, what if you are serving not as a BCBA in a situation, but you're serving as a teacher, and you are not happy with what the BCBA is doing? However, it's not your role to be the BCBA for that client. Or you are part of a parent teaching group, and a parent is really spending a lot of time trying to discuss pseudoscientific or anti-scientific procedures as a part of the group.
Yeah, these were, we also discussed these a bit because they were tricky. I don't know. I don't know what the right answer is, to be honest, but I think it depends on really what's going on, all those other factors. Are you also a BCBA? Do you have that background? What is your relationship to the family in this situation? Sometimes would it really be your place to ask the BCBA questions, confront them directly before telling the family what's going on? Just ask. Maybe there's parts you don't understand. If it's really a safety concern, if they're doing things during the day that are unsafe for the child, then don't bother asking the questions, and you really should tell the family, because then it becomes, a duty to report. So I think it depends really what's going on, and start with, if everything is safe, I would start with communication again, but staying away from that dual relationship, because it could get so tricky.
Mm.
In the case of, say, for instance, you're conducting a parent workshop, or, you're doing some parent coaching, and, parents are adamant in terms of, hey, I read something in this newspaper article. Who reads a newspaper anymore? But, I watched the news on this. I saw this on social media, and I really want to try this. I think we need to really look at the perspective of our parents. And I think as BCBAs, we don't do that enough. So put ourselves in parent shoes. And if you were a parent in this situation, I mean, I am a parent. I'm not I'm a parent, but I don't lead my child's life from a BCBA role. I lead my child's life I'm a parent. And I think about what if, right? Like if I was a parent and I didn't do this, would I always look back and say, what if, right? Our job as a BCBA is not to go, just go out and do that. Absolutely. And go and do this. Our job as a BCBA is to educate our parents on effective treatments and what's clinically appropriate, and to be able to say, okay, I don't know enough about this, but here's what you need to look out for. Research this, and this. So make them, look at. You're not necessarily saying, don't do that, but you are opening their eyes to saying, this might not be the right approach, or this isn't, effective, or there's no data to support this. But as a BCBA, you can't necessarily go out and tell a parent that right off the hop, because a parent's going to get their back up. It's that relationship. But if you can tell them, well, you know what, look for this, and this. And if all else fails, make sure I can help you with a baseline. Let's take baseline data right now. And then let's take baseline data again, or not baseline, but let's take baseline data right now. And then if you are going to do this, let's take continued behavior data throughout. And what are you trying to achieve? What is your end goal by introducing whatever you're going to be introducing? Let's measure to see if that's working, and let's keep touching base on that. Mm-hmm. And as a BCBA, that's really what you need to be doing is, you need to be advocating for your clients, and you yourself needs to be providing effective treatment. But if a parent wants to go out and do all these other things because they need to tick these boxes of what if, you can be there on the sidelines to support and to try and support with data.
Mm.
I was actually reading an article recently about humble behaviorism, which I thought, connects to this, because so often we hear about knocking down things that aren't evidence-based. It's not evidence-based, so like we're just going to tell families not to do it. And this article talked about how we have to be a little bit more open-minded. We don't own the principles of behavior. And so when these kind of things come up, really exactly what Shayna was saying is, instead of like knocking it down, thinking about what's the value to the family, asking questions, trying to understand it, and then having data and documentation. And I think that goes along with kind of, full circle what you said at the beginning in terms of qualities of a good behavior analyst, which is collaborative, and it is humility, and it is all these things that when we do come up with these ethical scenarios, still incorporating these qualities, that we're not coming across as like we report everybody and nothing is evidence-based and everything is black and white, and and sometimes we kind of jump the gun with a lot of those things.
Mm.
Yeah, that humble behaviorism article is really, really good. It's Kirby et al., I think 2022. And then the other one that I would highly recommend in terms of this convo is Broadhead et al. 2015, where they lay out an awesome flowchart that will help you assess non-behavioral treatments and determine if there is basically a safety need to intervene on behalf of the client, and otherwise to, assist everyone in seeing what the potential merits or limitations of a non-behavioral treatment might be.
Mm. All right. Well, we could probably, I mean, I don't think there was a single one of these where I was just enjoying hearing everyone, but it just made me think of more codes. Like, should we bring up that code? What about when that code would be relevant? So, of course, as with any ethics discussion, it's not like there's, and that was the one ethics answer. And if you do that, it'll be fine. And anything else is bad. No, there's a lot of gray. There are a lot of pieces in play. But let's move into dissemination station to kind of wrap up and talk about some steps we can take as behavior analysts to sort of generally prepare for ethical situations in our lives and in the future. So Shayna and Shira, I'd love to start with both of you. I think, we talked about a couple key points in terms of how to promote ethical behavior long-term for individuals. But if you sort of had to pick one skill, I know there are multiple skills, so it's not a fair question in some ways, but if you had to pick one that you would recommend if folks want to get ahead of ethical quandaries in the future, they should probably practice.
I think we've said it. Communication. Good communication was the theme.
And what anything else? Like, what would be the second one? They're great at communication. They're not worried about that. They want a second one.
Reading the code. That would be, I'd say, know the code. Like, read it. Know the code. Know the flow chart. Know the principles that we should be following, those 4 principles that guide the code, and just have it handy.
And have somewhere to go if you don't know. Like, that's what people are for. That's what we're for. That's what your colleagues are for. And so you don't have to figure it out all on your own. So, like, have people.
Call a friend. John Bailey has an ABA hotline, an ABA ethics hotline. I've used it before. He is phenomenal. He called me himself within 24 hours, and it was phenomenal. Use it. Talk to somebody if you really don't know the answer. And there is no answer. I think that's the other key thing is, unfortunately, there is no black and white here. There is no correct answer. Yep, I got that one right. So it is really helpful to be effective in communicating and to be able to call a friend.
That was going to be my ad as well, is that we want to have open lines of communication, and with that, support for newbie CBAs. So the Gladowski article and then the Cox article and the LeBlanc article that came before it are all speaking to how you can develop these ethics sort of support networks within your organization. And those are some great models for folks if they want to be looking at how they can do this to better support their new BCBAs, because there's so much decision making, right? Have you guys heard the thing where it's like as a person you make like 30,000 decisions or something every day, and some of them are not really very meaningful, but they still require brain power, and so that's why even if at the end of a day you're tired from just living your day because you've expended energy in doing these things. And then folks who are teachers are doing that like tenfold or something because they're busy monitoring little lives, right? And so I think being an RBT and a BCBA has that same additional level of decision making on the fly that has to occur, and that's really stressful. So the more you can have that support system and feel prepared in making those decisions, the easier the transition into being a BCBA is going to be.
And I would say to anyone listening to this and folks in the How to ABA community, I think we discussed some really great questions. Thank you for sending them in. And Shayna and Shira, thank you for bringing them to us. If you are on the lookout for a job and you're wondering, is this an organization that values ethics? Maybe bring up some of these questions as, I worked at a place where blank happened. Maybe that's not 100% true, but situations like this could happen. How would you handle them here? And if you get a lot of, that's a great question, something like that would never happen here, hit the door. That place probably doesn't have what you're looking for in setting up these systems to maintain your own ethical behavior.
You say, we're just like a big family.
Yeah, that never happens here. We're all very ethical. That's not what I asked. Oh boy. Well, Shayna and Shira from How to ABA, thank you so very much for coming on the show. Thank you so much to your listeners too for coming up with such really thought-provoking ethical questions that we could discuss tonight. I've increasingly enjoyed talking about ethics as I get older. I used to hate it so very much because it was very complicated and there was no one right answer. But over time, it has become very exciting to get to have these discussions and have some minor disagreements and, review of some of the steps we need to take and moving the focus away from good versus bad and more of the harm, no harm steps to take, steps that you might not need to take, and really thinking about these situations as very complex, just like most human behavior. So we thank you so much for your time. If folks want to check out How to ABA, listen to the show, where should they go? Or if they have extra scenarios they want to throw your way because they liked hearing your discussions tonight.
So they can check on our website, howtoaba.com. And from there, you can visit our podcast, our blog. And if you have live questions, become a member to join our mentorship community.
Excellent.
Cool.
And we'll have a link too in the notes, folks. Yeah. So if you don't remember, it's a great name. You should be able to remember to type it in, but just in case, you got a link in the notes. Cut down the response effort.
Thank you for having us. This was a great conversation. It's always good to keep this top of mind. So it's a good reminder for us too. And I really enjoyed.
Thanks for coming. This was super fun.
Thank you. Thanks once again to Shayna Gaunt and Shira Carpel from How to ABA. And thanks to their listeners for coming up with such great scenarios. Thanks to them for their great points on what to do in some of those situations, those keys of communication, having good systems in place, all very
being
important.
All around excellent.
Just being all around. No, you don't need to be all around excellent to be ethical. It helps. But you don't need to be doing that. You can focus on a few areas at a time to be exemplary. And we did not mention
never stop learning.
We didn't mention it. We did mention never stop learning. We didn't mention being ethical was considered one of the most likely to be rated exemplary tasks. So being ethical is important, if only just because you want everyone to think you're the coolest BCBA in town. We want to make sure you get that second secret code word. It is membership. MEMBERSHIP. You are a member. You joined the membership of ethical BCBAs.
On the good ship. Membership.
Yep, that works too. Very nice. And let's move on to our last section of the show, pairings.
Hey, hooray. It's time for pairings. In pairings, I let you know about other past episodes of ABA Inside Track that you might want to check out if you found this one compelling. And goody for you, there's a bunch of them many of them are ethics CEUs as well, if that floats your boat. They include 2 episodes that we've done with Dr. Darren Shush, talking about ethics. We call them our ethics grab bag.
Ethics mailbag.
Ethics mailbag. What do we call it? We call it our ethics mailbags. That's episodes 105 and 203. You can check those out. Also, you can check out episode 200, where we talk about ethical decision making with Dr. Matthew Broadhead. You could listen to episode 52, You Need an Ethics Coordinator. You could also listen to episode 244, where we talked about moving from ABA student to ABA practitioner. That was with Kia Lyons and the Babbitt student group. And finally, episode 278, which is a 2-hour episode where we discuss the Ethics Book Club with Linda LeBlanc and Amanda Carson. I also like to recommend a snack to go with these episodes if you're so inclined. And today, those snacks are going to have some Canadian flavor to them. So I'm going to recommend poutine, which I love and Jackie loves as well.
This is not the first time you've recommended poutine on pairings, I think, Diana.
It's okay. You can repeat them.
Oh, okay.
For this. It's not like code words.
Okay.
They can repeat. And also those delicious like maple candies. Those are good. Pairings.
Very nice. All right. Well, thank you all so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed our episode of ABA Inside Track. If you did, please subscribe to the show. You can also find us online at abainsidetrack.com, where you can find links to all of the episodes we've done, as well as a place to purchase CEs. If you want more ABA Inside Track content, as soon as it is released, you can support us also on our Patreon page, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can subscribe for free and get episodes a week ahead of time, or you can subscribe at the $3, $5, $10, or $20 levels to get additional bonuses, including a chance to vote on our quarterly listener choice episodes, to get free CEs for listener choice and book club episodes, which is a lot of CEs per year, just saying, and also a chance to vote on our book club episodes and to get those episodes right when they come out. Some folks have to wait a whole year for those book clubs, but not you, the patron. Patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. Well, we also want to give a couple other thanks. Certainly, once again, thank you to Shayna and Shira from How to ABA. We also want to thank Dr. Jim Carr for his playing of our theme song, our friend Kyle Sturry for his interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.